The moving truck was late, but when we finally pulled up to Sycamore Grove, it felt like the start of our new life. Little did we know, this quiet neighborhood had its own secrets. The sun was just starting to dip behind the row of trees lining Sycamore Grove, casting long shadows on the freshly painted houses. It was the perfect autumn afternoon, the kind where the cool breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of change. David and Emily stood together in the driveway of their new home, gazing at the house they'd just bought, still piled high with cardboard boxes waiting to be unpacked. "It's perfect," Emily said, her voice warm with the excitement of their new beginning. She rested her hand on her round belly, smiling up at David. "I can already picture us here for years to come. This is where we'll raise our family." David squeezed her hand, nodding as he surveyed the house and its surroundings. He couldn't help but share in her optimism, though a small part of him was still adjusting to the idea of leaving the bustle of city life behind. "It's quieter than I expected. A nice change." They had moved across the state from bustling Los Angeles to this suburban paradise, a peaceful community that promised a slower pace of life. Sycamore Grove was tucked away from the hectic rush of the big city, with streets lined with oak trees and manicured lawns. It felt like the perfect place to start over, a place where Emily could focus on her career as a school principal and David could settle into his new remote job, all while preparing for the arrival of their first child. But as they unloaded the last of the boxes from the truck, Emily's smile faltered when she saw the woman standing at the end of their driveway. She was dressed in a polo shirt with a stiff collar, her bleach blonde hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, and a clipboard clutched firmly in her hand. "Welcome to Sycamore Grove," the woman said, her smile a little too wide, a little too practiced. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning Emily's round belly before flicking over to the car parked in the driveway. "I'm Karen, the HOA president here. And I've got some paperwork for you." David frowned, glancing at Emily before offering a polite nod. Thanks," he said, not sure what to make of this sudden intrusion. Emily, ever the polite one, smiled and accepted the pamphlet Karen handed her. "It's our community's guidelines," Karen continued, her voice chipper but sharp, as if the words were rehearsed. "We take pride in maintaining a certain standard here, you know. Just some things to be aware of, like lawn care, fence colors, and other community rules. You'll get used to it." Emily's smile tightened, but she said nothing, feeling an unease settle in her stomach. She wasn't sure why, but something about Karen's presence seemed off. There was something too controlling in her tone, like she was sizing them up, evaluating them. David shifted uncomfortably, giving a small, polite laugh. "We'll definitely take a look at this." "Thanks." Karen's gaze lingered a little too long on Emily's belly, then swept over the house, inspecting the small details as if searching for an infraction. "Must be nice," she said, her voice turning slightly colder. "Having the time to focus on your family. Some of us have to work harder for it." Emily blinked, taken aback by the comment. Before she could respond, Karen turned and started walking away. "Enjoy your move-in," she called over her shoulder, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. David watched her retreating figure with a growing sense of discomfort. "That was weird," he muttered. Emily, still holding the pamphlet, nodded slowly. "I don't know. She just watched us." She shook her head, trying to shake off the feeling of being scrutinized. "Maybe she's just one of those neighborhood watch types." They went back to unloading the truck, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just Karen's cold smile or her overly critical gaze. There was something about the way she carried herself, as if she believed she had the right to oversee every little detail of their lives. Later that evening, as the last of the boxes were brought inside, Emily glanced at the pamphlet Karen had left. Her eyes skimmed over the words printed in neat, professional font, "Your lawn, your duty." It all seemed harmless enough, but the more she read, the more the weight of Karen's words lingered. The next day, the first of what would be several HOA notices arrived. David opened it with a sigh, expecting the usual welcome packet. But as he scanned the letter, his face tightened in disbelief. "Emily," he called, holding up the paper. "You're not going to believe this." The letter detailed an infractions list, the trash cans had been left out too long, the fence color wasn't the exact shade of beige required, and there was something about a whimsical mailbox light. "It's a solar light," David muttered incredulously, shaking his head. "This is crazy." Emily frowned, her eyes darting to the street outside. "This can't be right. There's no way they could be serious about these things." But the thought of Karen and her sharp eyes on their home made Emily wonder if it wasn't the beginning of something far more controlling. "We didn't know it yet, but that pamphlet would be the start of a battle we never wanted." Underscore 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 underscore. It wasn't the first notice. It wasn't the second. But by the fifth letter, we knew this wasn't a mistake. We were being watched. The mailbox was full again, a thick envelope sticking out like it had been shoved in with purpose. David pulled it out and turned it over, already feeling a familiar frustration rise in his chest. He had hoped, no, expected, things would calm down after the first notice, but here it was, another letter from the HOA, with more petty accusations. Emily joined him on the porch, where he had already torn open the envelope. The usual sterile paper with HOA's seal was folded inside, but this time, the letter was longer than before. David scanned the text and sighed. Another violation. This time it's about the mailbox. Emily raised an eyebrow. "What now?" "They say it's too whimsical," David muttered, holding up the paper as if the words themselves were absurd. "It's a simple solar light on top. Nothing out of the ordinary." Emily ran her hands through her hair, frustration building behind her eyes. "It's like they're looking for anything to complain about." They both knew it wasn't just about the mailbox. It was the constant barrage of notices that had begun, each one pointing out increasingly minor offenses. The trash bins left out for too long. The grass not trimmed exactly to the prescribed height. Even the color of their fence was now in question. All of it seemed trivial, yet the frequency of the warnings had begun to take a toll. As the days went on, the letters kept coming. Each one felt like a personal attack, a constant reminder that they were being watched. Emily started to feel paranoid every time she stepped outside. Was someone observing her while she watered the plants or checked the mail? It wasn't just the notices, it was the feeling that they were under constant scrutiny. One evening, after dinner, another letter arrived. This one was different, more formal, more aggressive. It stated that their property was now under close observation due to repeated violations, and failure to comply would result in further action. The words were carefully chosen to sound official, but the undertone was clear: comply or face consequences. Emily took the letter and read it aloud, her voice barely a whisper as she reached the last line. "If this continues, a fine will be issued. This is your final warning." David clenched his jaw. "This is ridiculous." "That's not even the worst part," Emily said, showing him a second page. There, in bold letters, was a reminder that the HOA maintained the right to conduct random inspections. Inspections? For what? To make sure our lawn ornaments aren't offensive to anyone. David shook his head, clearly at a loss. "What do we do now?" Emily looked out the window at the quiet street. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden glow across the houses. "I don't know," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "But something doesn't feel right. This is more than just rules. It's personal." The following week, as if on cue, Karen appeared again. She was standing at the end of their driveway with her clipboard, as if she had just been waiting for the right moment. Emily was inside, but she could see Karen's figure through the window as she approached David, who had just returned from work. "Mr. Randall," Karen called, her tone falsely sweet. "I noticed the mailbox again. It's still not in compliance, you know." David tried to smile, though it was strained. "We're looking into it. I promise we'll make the changes." "That's what you said last time," Karen replied, glancing over at the house with a disapproving look. But we'll see if the HOA agrees. As Karen walked away, David stood frozen, watching her retreating figure. He had never felt more uncomfortable in his own home. We laughed it off at first, but something told me we hadn't seen the worst of it yet. Later that evening, after a silent dinner, Emily couldn't shake the unease. David, do you think she's just watching us? Like, really watching us? David exhaled slowly, looking out the window. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that seemed too deliberate, as if everyone was waiting for something. I don't know, he replied. But this isn't normal. It's like she's trying to make us feel like we don't belong here. The tension in the house grew with each passing day. Even the simplest things, like checking the mailbox or walking to the car, began to feel like an act of defiance. They had moved to Sycamore Grove for peace, for a fresh start, but now, it felt like they were in a war zone. And Karen was the one leading the charge. That barbecue should have been a simple welcome to the neighborhood. Instead, it turned into a stage for the showdown we couldn't avoid. The sun was still high in the sky as the evening approached, casting a soft, golden hue over Sycamore Grove. It was the kind of late autumn evening that begged for a barbecue. The air smelled faintly of grilled meat and freshly cut vegetables, and a light breeze stirred the leaves in the trees. The neighborhood had come together for what was meant to be a friendly event, a way to welcome the new neighbors and get to know each other better. But for Emily and David, it felt like the calm before the storm. The picnic tables were covered in mismatched tablecloths, plates piled high with pasta salad, chips, and burgers. Neighbors mingled, exchanging pleasantries, with a few couples sitting and chatting, their laughter rising into the air. Emily was trying her best to enjoy the evening, her pregnant belly heavy as she sat in a chair, a glass of iced tea in hand. David was by the grill, flipping burgers, but his eyes kept darting back toward Emily. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. And when Karen showed up, clipboard in hand, smiling that tight, insincere smile, he knew that the uneasy feeling was about to come to a head. Ah, the Randall family. Karen's voice cut through the noise like a knife, loud and unmistakable. She walked toward Emily, her heels clicking on the gravel. I'm so glad you could join us tonight, Karen said, her eyes flicking over Emily's belly in that calculating way David had come to recognize. Though I must say, I'm surprised to see you here after all the violations. Emily stiffened, her smile fading as she set her glass down on the table. What are you talking about? She asked, trying to keep her tone level. Karen's smile grew wider, but it didn't reach her eyes. Oh, nothing much, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Just that little solar light on your mailbox. It's not exactly the approved shade, is it? She glanced at David, who had turned toward them, sensing the tension. And the fence, well, it's a bit too beige. Don't you think? The laughter around them died down as the others took notice of the scene unfolding. David took a step forward, a flash of anger crossing his face. Karen, now is not the time or place for this. Oh, but it is, Karen said, her tone sharp, as if daring him to argue. She turned back to Emily, ignoring David completely. You know, some women just don't seem to know their place, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. They get so distracted with family matters, they forget about the real responsibilities, like keeping up with their property. The air seemed to grow colder, the words hanging in the air like a weight. Emily's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and she felt her stomach churn. The crowd had gone quiet, some of the neighbors looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. Only a few seemed to be looking at Karen with anything less than approval. David's hand balled into a fist at his side, but he held back, trying to keep his composure. Karen, you've made your point, he said through clenched teeth. Enough. But Karen wasn't finished. She leaned in closer to Emily, her smile widening. You know, she said in a tone that was far too sweet, it must be exhausting, carrying all that weight. Maybe that's why you're not so attentive to your responsibilities. Emily froze, the sting of Karen's words cutting deep. She could feel her face heat up with a mixture of anger and shame, but something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to let Karen continue this, not here, not now. "I think you should leave," Emily said, her voice steady but cold. "I won't stand here and let you humiliate me." Karen blinked, taken aback by the boldness of Emily's response, but then her smile returned, even more forced. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "I'm just trying to help you, really." David stepped in between them, his posture tense. "Leave. Now." There was a brief silence, the tension hanging heavy in the air. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Finally, Karen let out a huff, her expression souring. "Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you." She turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The moment she was out of earshot, the tension in the air loosened, but it left a bitter taste behind. Emily sat back down, her hands shaking slightly, and David followed her, sitting beside her and placing a comforting hand on her back. "We can't keep letting her do this," Emily said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "This isn't just about the rules. This is personal." David nodded, his jaw tight. "I know. It's like she's trying to make us feel like we don't belong here." "We're at a breaking point," Emily said, her eyes scanning the crowd, who had now returned to their conversations. "But I didn't expect it to come so soon. Every time we thought Karen had reached her limit, she found a new way to push our buttons." It had been 2 weeks since the barbecue, and the tension in the house was palpable. Emily could barely focus on anything anymore, her mind constantly racing back to Karen's smirking face, the cruel words that had been spoken in front of their neighbors. The feeling of being watched, judged, had only grown since then. The letters kept coming, each more ridiculous than the last. At first, they had laughed them off, thinking they were just nitpicking. But the more notices they received, the more they realized this wasn't just about rules, it was about control. One chilly afternoon, David came home to find yet another letter from the HOA waiting in the mailbox. He opened it with a sigh, expecting the usual petty complaint, but what he read made his blood run cold. The HOA was accusing them of excessive noise, because their baby monitor had caused a disturbance in the neighborhood. How can they even say that? David muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. Emily, who had been sitting on the couch with her laptop, looked up at him. Her face was a picture of frustration. "It's like she's waiting for us to make a mistake. There's no way we're this loud." David flopped down next to her, rubbing his temples. "This is getting out of hand." Emily leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "It's not just this notice. She's been everywhere. Standing by the mailbox, lurking outside when I water the plants. I've even caught her standing near the fence, writing things down. I'm starting to think she's just looking for a reason to escalate things." David looked at her, his expression serious. "We need to stop letting her walk all over us." They had tried to handle this quietly, hoping the situation would resolve itself. But with each new notice, it became clear they couldn't just wait for Karen to get bored. They had to act. Emily stood up, walking over to the bookshelf where they kept all their important documents. She pulled out the binder they had started compiling after the first few notices. Inside were copies of every letter, every violation, every accusation. It was like a ticking time bomb, each page adding more fuel to the fire. "We need to start taking this seriously," Emily said, flipping through the pages. "I'm going to start researching the HOA bylaws. There has to be something in here we can use." David nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I'll look into lawyers. We need someone who knows what they're doing." That evening, they sat down together, poring over legal documents and articles online. They were still uncertain about how far Karen would go, but they knew they couldn't back down anymore. Every moment they spent avoiding the confrontation only made the situation worse. They needed to take control back. The following morning, Emily sat down with a cup of coffee at the local cafe, where she met with a lawyer who had come highly recommended. The small, cozy cafe was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. The lawyer, a woman named Sarah, was warm but professional as they discussed their options. She listened carefully as Emily laid out the timeline of events, each notice, each encounter with Karen. "Sounds like you're being harassed," Sarah said after a pause, her brow furrowed. "The HOA is overstepping its bounds, and Karen's behavior? It's not just petty, it's potentially illegal. We'll need to gather more evidence, but you have a case." Emily felt a wave of relief mixed with anxiety. It wasn't going to be easy, but at least they had a path forward. She left the cafe feeling more determined than ever. Karen had crossed the line, and now they were going to hold her accountable. Back at home, David had been busy organizing their paperwork. He had compiled a list of every rule the HOA had violated, every letter that had been sent, and every infraction they could prove was absurd. He was ready. They both were. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the chill of the evening air set in, Emily and David sat at their kitchen table, papers spread out in front of them. There was no turning back now. They had the evidence. They had the lawyer. It was time to take action. As I looked at the papers in front of me, I realized the battle wasn't just about the rules anymore. It was about taking back control. We had gathered our evidence, but we hadn't anticipated how far Karen was willing to go to protect her power. The days blurred together in a haze of paperwork, phone calls, and meetings. Emily and David spent every waking hour preparing for what they knew would be a long and grueling legal battle. They had compiled every letter, every notice, every piece of evidence that showed the HOA's abuse of power. But the more they learned, the more they realized just how deep the corruption ran, and how far Karen would go to maintain control over Sycamore Grove. The first meeting with their lawyer, Sarah, had been hopeful. But as the weeks went on, the weight of the situation began to set in. They had learned more than they had wanted to about the inner workings of their neighborhood's HOA, and the more they uncovered, the more it became clear that they were up against an entrenched system. They met with Sarah in her small office, papers stacked high on the desk between them. The soft hum of a fan in the corner did little to ease the tension. Sarah's face was grim as she flipped through their evidence. "You've got a solid case," she said, her voice steady but tinged with concern. "But Karen isn't going to give up easily. You're dealing with someone who's not used to being challenged." David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What's the next step?" Sarah looked at them, her gaze hard. "Next, we need to file. The documentation you've gathered is good, but we'll need to go over it all with a fine-tooth comb. The HOA's bylaws are written to protect them, and Karen will fight tooth and nail to keep things under her control." Emily clenched her fists in her lap, her jaw tight. "She's not going to get away with this," she said, her voice low but firm. "I know," Sarah said. "But we need to be prepared. If this goes to court, you'll need more than just evidence. You'll need to show a pattern of abuse, and that means digging deeper into the HOA's operations." They spent hours going over the documents, each one more frustrating than the last. Every complaint filed by the HOA seemed to be a minor infraction, until it wasn't. Each violation, no matter how small, was treated like a threat. David and Emily had to admit that they had underestimated Karen's determination. As the days turned into weeks, the stress of the legal fight began to take its toll. The quiet evenings they had once enjoyed in Sycamore Grove were now filled with late-night discussions about court strategies and gathering more evidence. The fear of the unknown loomed large. Would they be able to prove their case? Would Karen fight back in ways they hadn't even thought of? One evening, Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea forgotten beside her as she read over more legal documents. Her mind raced as she thought about everything they had learned. "We're not just fighting for our home," she said quietly. "We're fighting for the whole neighborhood. Karen can't be allowed to run things this way." David, sitting across from her, looked up from his own stack of papers. "I know," he said. "And I'm ready to fight. But I won't let her take everything we've worked for." It was then that they made their decision. They were done waiting. They were done letting Karen push them around. They would file the lawsuit, no matter what it took. The next morning, David and Emily met with Sarah again, this time to prepare the final documents for the lawsuit. There was a new sense of urgency in the air, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. They went over the details, each page a small but significant victory in the battle for control over their lives. When the papers were ready, they drove them to the courthouse, their hearts pounding as they handed them over to the clerk. The paperwork was filed, and the ball was officially rolling. We sent the papers off, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The courtroom wasn't just about the facts, it was about who could convince everyone that they were right. The heavy doors of the courthouse closed behind David and Emily as they stepped into the crowded lobby. The tension was thick, the air vibrating with the murmur of voices, whispers of the upcoming trials swirling around them. Emily's heart raced as she held the folder of documents tightly in her hands. The legal fight was no longer just about them, it was about their community, their home, and proving they had been wronged. The courtroom itself was even more intimidating. Long rows of hard wooden benches stretched across the room, filled with spectators. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The walls were lined with dark wood, and the fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally, casting a cold light over the proceedings. At the front, the judge's podium stood like a silent sentinel, while the tables for both sides were stacked with paperwork, ready for battle. Karen had arrived earlier, her posture rigid as she sat at the front with her attorney. Her face was set in a tight, determined frown, but anyone who looked closely could see the nervous tension in her shoulders. She wasn't used to being questioned, much less accused. She had always been the one with the power, the one in control. Now, she was fighting to hold on to it. David and Emily made their way to their seats, their eyes briefly meeting those of a few familiar faces in the crowd. There were a handful of neighbors who had shown their support, nodding encouragingly as they passed. But there were also others, standing stiffly with arms crossed, clearly loyal to Karen and the HOA. It was strange to think how something so small, a neighborhood dispute, had now divided the entire community. David squeezed Emily's hand as they sat down. "We can do this," he whispered. She nodded, but the doubt was there in her eyes. She knew this battle would be hard, but they had come too far to back down now. The trial began promptly, with the judge entering the room, a stern expression on her face. She glanced at both parties before calling the proceedings to order. "We're here today to hear the case against the Sycamore Grove HOA, specifically regarding accusations of harassment and unlawful surveillance. Both parties will present their evidence. Let's begin with the plaintiffs." David stood up first, his hands gripping the podium as he spoke to the court. He was calm, collected, but there was a fire behind his words. He outlined the history of the HOA's treatment of their family, how they had been scrutinized, judged for minor infractions, and made to feel unwelcome in their own home. He spoke of the constant surveillance, of Karen's repeated visits, and the letters that seemed to grow more personal and vindictive with each passing day. As he presented the evidence, emails, photos of Karen lurking near their fence, the letters from the HOA, the room grew still. Emily sat quietly beside him, the weight of their argument heavy on her shoulders. This was their fight, and now it was time for the world to see just how far Karen had gone. Karen's lawyers stood next, trying to downplay the accusations. "Your Honor, what we have here is a simple case of enforcement of community standards. There has been no harassment. The HOA is merely doing its job, ensuring that the neighborhood maintains its integrity." The words were weak, and David could see that even some of the more sympathetic neighbors were beginning to question the HOA's actions. But Karen wasn't done yet. She stood up, her voice sharp as she addressed the court, her eyes scanning the room for support. "This is a smear campaign," Karen said, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. "They're trying to make me out to be some kind of villain, when all I've ever done is try to keep this community in order. If anything, it's them who have been disruptive, ignoring the rules, making a mockery of what this neighborhood stands for." Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, but she quickly recovered, her eyes narrowing at David and Emily. The room fell into a tense silence as the words hung in the air. No one moved, and for a moment, it felt like the entire courthouse was holding its breath. The judge, an older woman with a stern face, glanced down at her notes, her fingers tapping on the desk as she processed the information. Emily felt her stomach twist. Was Karen convincing the court? Was she convincing the community? The whispers in the audience grew louder, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a legal case, it was a battle for their reputations, for their lives. The tension in the room escalated as both sides presented their closing arguments. David and Emily's evidence was solid, undeniable even. But Karen had her supporters, and the words she used were designed to paint them as the troublemakers. The judge seemed unmoved by the theatrics, but Emily could sense the growing division among the spectators. The truth was, this wasn't just about the facts. It was about who could convince everyone that they were right. The judge gave a final, brief remark before she left to deliberate, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "I will review the evidence and make my decision shortly." David and Emily sat back down, the weight of the day sinking in. Their hands found each other once more, and as they exchanged a look, it was clear that this was far from over. The judge was about to speak, and everyone in the room held their breath, waiting for the final decision. Karen thought she had everything under control, until she walked into that courtroom and realized the tables had turned. The day of the verdict arrived with a heavy, suffocating weight. David and Emily sat side by side in the same courtroom where they had spent countless hours fighting for their home, their community, and their right to live in peace. The room was packed with spectators, neighbors, friends, and those who had been watching the saga unfold from the sidelines. The tension was palpable, and as the judge prepared to announce her decision, it felt as though time itself had come to a standstill. Karen sat across the room, her face rigid with determination, though it was clear to anyone watching that the confidence she once exuded had begun to crumble. Gone was the smug sense of control she had displayed at the beginning of the trial. Now, she seemed frail, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. Even her usual sharp posture had slackened, as if the weight of her own guilt was bearing down on her. David and Emily exchanged a glance, their hands clasped together tightly. They had come a long way from the first day they had received that pamphlet from Karen, and now they were on the verge of winning the fight they had never asked for. But even as they felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of uncertainty lingered in the air. Winning in court was one thing, but winning the war for the neighborhood, and their peace of mind, was another. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, stood at her podium and called the room to order. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "The court has reviewed the evidence and testimony presented by both sides," she began, her eyes scanning the room. "It is clear that the actions of the Sycamore Grove HOA, particularly those of its president, Karen Randall, have violated the rights of the plaintiffs." Emily could feel her heart race as the judge continued. The HOA's harassment, undue surveillance, and repeated violations of privacy were unfounded and unjust. The court finds in favor of the plaintiffs. A collective sigh of relief swept through David and Emily as they exchanged a quiet, knowing look. It wasn't over yet, but it was clear now, they had won. Karen's face twisted in shock as she heard the verdict. For the first time in months, her mask of authority slipped, and for a brief moment, she looked like a woman who had been backed into a corner. Her chest rose and fell as she struggled to regain control of herself, her eyes wide with disbelief. But the damage was done. The evidence had spoken for itself. The witnesses had told their stories. Karen's attempts to deflect blame and twist the facts had fallen flat. The room had seen through her facade, and there was no coming back from that. David and Emily allowed themselves a quiet moment of victory. It was a small, bittersweet win. Yes, they had fought back. Yes, they had beaten Karen and the HOA. But they knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. Karen stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor as she gathered her papers. "This isn't over," she hissed under her breath, as if speaking to herself. Her eyes locked onto Emily for a brief moment, and Emily could feel the heat of her gaze, a silent threat that lingered long after Karen had turned to leave the room. David squeezed Emily's hand, his voice soft but firm. "It's over. But we're not done yet." As the judge raised her gavel to finalize the ruling, Karen's face turned pale. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. The gavel struck, echoing through the courtroom. "The court orders the dissolution of the Sycamore Grove HOA. Karen Randall is hereby removed from her position as president. All fines and retaliatory actions are to be nullified. The room erupted into murmurs, some in shock, others in disbelief, and a few even in applause. For David and Emily, the noise was a blur. They were too focused on the moment they had won. As they walked out of the courtroom, their heads held high, they could feel the weight of the victory settle in. They had fought for what was right and justice had been served. But even as they stepped into the bright light of the afternoon, they knew this was only the beginning. The damage to their community, to their peace of mind, was far from healed. There would be repercussions. There would be a reckoning. But for now, they had won. And that was enough. We had won the battle, but it wasn't just about Karen. It was about the community she had tried to control. A month had passed since the court's final ruling, and Sycamore Grove was slowly starting to breathe again. The echoes of the court case had faded, but the changes in the community were unmistakable. People who had once stayed silent were now speaking up, and a sense of unity had begun to replace the old fear of authority. The neighborhood that had been under Karen's iron grip was finally free, and the transformation was as visible as the falling leaves of autumn that now blanketed the streets. The tension that had once defined their lives was gone. David and Emily could finally enjoy a quiet evening without the looming shadow of Karen or the HOA's overbearing rules. They had their lives back, and for the first time in months, it felt like they could breathe. But there was more to it than just the freedom from Karen's control. It was the sense of triumph over fear, the victory for every neighbor who had lived in dread of the HOA's whims. One afternoon, as David sat in the living room, reading over some of the latest community updates, Emily walked in with a warm smile, holding a tray of fresh-baked cookies. "The neighbors are organizing a little get-together this weekend," she said. "They want to thank us for everything we've done." David looked up from the paper, surprised. "Really?" Emily nodded. "Seems like the tide has shifted. They're starting to realize how much of a hold Karen had on them. They want to celebrate not just the end of the HOA, but the beginning of something new." A week later, the event took place in the small park at the center of Sycamore Grove. It was a simple gathering: barbecues, picnic tables, homemade pies, and a few blankets spread out on the grass. But to David and Emily, it felt like so much more. As they walked through the park, they were greeted with warm smiles, handshakes, and heartfelt thanks. Their neighbors, who had once hesitated to speak up, were now openly sharing their appreciation. The mood was light, but there was an underlying sense of relief and gratitude in the air. People had begun to realize that the true spirit of community wasn't about following rigid rules, it was about helping one another, standing together, and finding common ground. The oppressive presence of the HOA was gone, and in its place was a renewed sense of unity. Karen, of course, was nowhere to be seen. After her removal from the HOA and the public shaming she had faced, she had retreated into her house, now largely ignored by the rest of the community. No one spoke of her anymore, and her influence had withered away. The neighbors who had once blindly followed her lead now understood the cost of allowing such control to fester, and they were determined to never let it happen again. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the park, the crowd gathered for a final toast. The soft murmur of conversation mixed with the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze, creating a sense of peace that hadn't been present for a long time. People raised their glasses, smiling and laughing, a feeling of camaraderie settling over them like a warm blanket. David and Emily stood together near the edge of the park, watching as their neighbors celebrated. Their son, who had grown quiet and withdrawn during the worst of the conflict, was now playing with the other children, laughing and running through the grass. For the first time in months, Emily felt a deep sense of relief. They had fought, they had won, and now they could finally heal. As the lights twinkled in the yard, I knew this wasn't just a celebration. It was a victory for all of us, against control, against fear, and against tyranny. The evening was filled with laughter, but there was also something deeper, a quiet pride that came from knowing they had stood up for what was right. The community was no longer just a place to live, it was a place to belong, to be part of something bigger than themselves. They had all learned a lesson, one that would stay with them long after the last light had flickered out and the last pie had been served. As the night drew to a close, David and Emily exchanged a smile. They didn't need any more words. They had done it. They had not only won the battle for their own home but had helped free an entire neighborhood from the grip of fear. The war may have been over, but the peace they had won would last for generations. As the sun set over Sycamore Grove, David and Emily stood together, watching their community thrive again. The battle against Karen and the HOA had not just freed their family, it had united everyone. In the face of oppressive control, they had learned that when people stand together, even the most powerful forces can be defeated. Like a steady light in a hidden window, one determined stand can guide a whole community through the darkest hours. Perhaps it's time to remember that the strength of a neighborhood lies not in its rules, but in the hearts of those who call it home. 4-0 Mini